Battle of the Coral Sea was a wake-up call for Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. America's remaining carriers stood between him and mastery of the Pacific. It was time for drastic action. America's carriers had to be destroyed. They had eluded Yamamoto at Pearl Harbor. He would not let them escape again. He decided to lay a trap. He would target something so valuable to the Americans that they would send out their carriers to protect it. And the bait for his trap would be Midway. Midway is in fact two tiny islands west of Hawaii, halfway between America and Japan. It was one of the few American air bases left in the Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was complex, and it involved the greatest naval fleet the world had ever seen. The main part of the fleet was divided into three groups. Yamamoto himself would be in a group centered around three big gun battleships. To the south, another group of ships carrying thousands of soldiers who would land on Midway and take control. But here was the spearhead of the attack. A group of 4 aircraft carriers and their escort ships, the Carrier Strike Force. The 248 aircraft of these carriers were given 2 critical tasks. First, they would bomb the defenses on Midway ahead of the planned landing. Then, they would stage a huge airstrike on the American carriers when they came to Midway's rescue. Leading the Carrier Strike Force would be Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo on his flagship the Akagi, the carrier from which he had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nagumo was a highly professional naval officer with over 30 years' service. The Japanese High Command was confident that Nagumo would once more lead the Imperial Japanese Navy to victory. But his carefully laid plans underestimated Admiral Nimitz, the American commander. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans had made military intelligence a top priority, and it had paid off. The Japanese naval code had been cracked. Here, at their intelligence headquarters in Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy deciphered details of Yamamoto's plan to set a trap at Midway. With this information, Nimitz now planned an ambush of his own. Nimitz now had 3 operational carriers in Pearl Harbor. The carriers USS Enterprise and USS Hornet departed first. Then the newly repaired USS Yorktown followed on a little way behind. The 3 carriers headed from Hawaii for a spot codenamed Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of the American base on Midway. By the 2nd of June, they were in position and lying in wait for the Japanese ships that were approaching from the northwest. Nimitz had given his commanders a single bold objective: to ambush the approaching Japanese fleet now heading for Midway and strike a decisive blow at its carriers. But these weren't the only preparations that Nimitz was making.
Out in the middle of the Pacific, the US base at Midway was buzzing with activity. Preparations were underway. Flight after flight of planes had been landing over the last few days. And now the small airfield was packed with as many planes as it could handle. These planes would be vital in the defense of the island. So would the US Marines, who would be waiting for the Japanese if they tried to land. By June the 3rd, the pilots were waiting by their planes, the Marines in their bunkers.
Nimitz had now done all he could. His ships were in position, his commanders briefed, and the garrison on Midway on full alert. But Nimitz knew he was about to be confronted with more aircraft carriers, more battleships and more destroyers than he had. He even knew roughly that they were coming from the northwest. The question was, where exactly were they all?
For days, sent out from Midway across the vast stretch of the Pacific Ocean, searching for the Japanese fleet. By the early hours of June 4th, 1942, researchers were already hotting up. The code breakers had discovered that the Japanese planned to attack on the fort, but there was still no sign of their fleet. The Pacific Ocean covers a quarter of the Earth's surface. For the Americans in their big and slow flying boats, finding the Japanese fleet in just a small sector of this vast expanse was an enormous task.
In fact, the 4 Japanese carriers had got within range of Midway without being spotted, and they had already launched their strike force.
Finally, at 5:40 that morning, an American scout plane spotted the huge formation of Japanese bombers and fighters heading towards Midway. The American pilot sent back an urgent warning. It was not a moment too soon.
The Japanese planes were aiming to destroy the parked American aircraft on the ground. The Battle of Midway was about to begin.
Within minutes, nearly every one of the American planes on Midway was taking off. The Americans were desperate not to be caught on the ground, as they had been at Pearl Harbor. A mixed batch of over 40 torpedo planes and bombers was dispatched without fighter escort to strike the distant Japanese fleet. And 25 fighters were sent up to intercept the formidable array of Japanese fighters and bombers that would soon arrive to attack Midway.
The American fighter pilots were in for a rough ride. Many of them had only just finished flight school and didn't have that many hours of flying under their belts. To make matters worse, even the best American fighter aircraft, this one, the Wildcat, was totally outmaneuvered by the Japanese fighter, the Zero. The Zero could outrun and outclimb anything the Americans could put in the sky against them.
These Zeros were going to be a real threat to the 25 American fighters sent to intercept them.
Suddenly, Wildcats appeared and dashed through our formation. Our Zero fighters saw this, and in a 5-minute dogfight, all the Wildcats were chased away.
The American fighters did manage to shoot down a couple of enemy bombers, but for the most part, they didn't stand a chance against the Japanese in their Zeros. After all, the Japanese pilots were among the most experienced and best trained naval aviators in the world. After only a few minutes, nearly every single American fighter that had taken off from Midway had been shot down into the ocean.
At 6:34 a.m., the Japanese arrived over Midway and began attacking the airfield. The Americans fought back bravely, but their island base was shattered. But despite the destruction they'd inflicted, the Japanese realized that their real targets were missing. The American bombers weren't there.
Within minutes, the news that the American bombers had not been destroyed on the ground by the attack on Midway reached Vice Admiral Nagumo on his flagship, the carrier Akagi. But he didn't have long to wait to find out where they'd gone. They were now directly above his carrier fleet and beginning their attack.
As the American bombers dived into action, they were pounced on by Japanese Zeros. Many of the Americans were shot down. The rest turned back for Midway. Not one of their bombs or torpedoes had hit its mark.
Nagumo's fleet had escaped this time, but he knew the surviving American bombers was still a threat. They could refuel on Midway and return to attack him. He had to destroy them when they landed on the island. On his carriers, Nagumo still had reserve aircraft. The trouble was they had the wrong weapons. They were armed with anti-ship weapons in case the US Navy showed up. But Nagumo was still unaware there were any American ships around, so he felt safe, replacing these anti-ship weapons with land bombs to attack Midway.
Below decks and the aircraft storage hangars of the Japanese carriers, new orders rang out. The crews quickly set to work removing the anti-ship weapons on the reserve planes and replacing them with bombs for a ground attack on Midway.
While his men worked furiously on the hangar decks below, Nagumo, on the bridge, was suddenly confronted with a real crisis. He received another message, this time from one of his scout planes. It had spotted what appeared to be 10 American ships northeast of Midway. The news came as a stunning shock. Nagumo had been sure there would be no American ships in the area. It was now blindingly obvious that things were not going as the Japanese had planned. Nagumo immediately suspended the planned second strike on Midway. He now had to deal with the threat from the American ships. He ordered his men to reattach the anti-ship weapons onto the reserve planes. And he sent a message straight back to his scout plane, demanding more information. If the American ships were carriers, Nagumo could be in real trouble. The American ships were, of course, carriers, and earlier that morning they had found the Japanese fleet. On board the American ships, preparations were gathering pace. The carriers Hornet and Enterprise were readying to launch their aircraft. In command of these two ships was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and now he had a critical decision to make. Spruance's carriers were located about 200 miles away from Midway, here on the map case. Yorktown was a little way off on its own. US scout planes had reported the Japanese carriers about 155 miles away from Spruance's position. The Japanese ships were within striking distance of some of his aircraft, but others could barely carry enough fuel to get there and back. There'd be little leeway for them to maneuver, even less for navigational errors. And if they ran out of fuel, the only place to go would be into the empty wastes of the Pacific. But Spruance decided that the critical issue was time. He had to hit the Japanese fleet before they discovered and annihilated his ships. He couldn't waste time moving his carriers any closer to the enemy to give his planes a better chance. So, in one of the greatest naval gambles in history, Spruance ordered all his aircraft into the air in one massed attack.
On board the American carriers, pilots made their final preparations. Many were nervous, especially on the Hornet. The Hornet's torpedo squadron had never gone into battle. Many of them had never taken off from a carrier with a torpedo, or a pickle as they called it, slung below them. Some had never even seen it done before.
As they walked out towards their planes, the pilots must have had the words of their squadron leader still ringing in their ears. He had told them, "I want each one of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there's only one plane left to make the final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give them hell."
After completing an inspection of the aircraft and its bomb, I climbed into the cockpit, and as I sat there waiting for the signal to start engines,
I suddenly got the same feeling of apprehension and butterflies in the stomach that I got before the start of competition in high school.
At 7 a.m., the launch began.
The pilots of the American Air Armada set off with little battle experience, limited fighter cover, and no margin for error. They were setting out across a vast stretch of ocean in small groups towards a deadly and experienced enemy.
If things were looking precarious for the Americans, back on Nagumo's carrier, the Akagi, events were beginning to get out of hand. Nagumo had been desperately waiting for his scout plane to tell him what kind of American ships it had spotted. Now, it gave him its answer. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier, bringing up the rear. It was a staggering blow to Nagumo. He'd never expected an American carrier to be in the area so soon. Its presence now jeopardized his entire operation. Nagumo knew he had no option. He had to launch a strike at the American carrier. But this realization couldn't have come at a worse time. These are the Japanese carriers here. Just at the moment Nagumo was hearing about the distant American carrier, his Midway attack aircraft began to return. They were low on fuel, but they needed to land quickly. Up above them, his fighter planes were also anxious to land. Nagumo now faced a critical decision, which could win or lose him the coming battle. He still had his reserve planes sitting on his carriers, but not all of them were loaded with the anti-ship weapons he now needed to attack the American fleet. He could choose to launch an immediate limited strike with the few reserve planes that were ready before his Midway attack aircraft landed. Alternatively, he could delay launching, land the circling Midway attack force, and then launch all his reserve planes, which by then would be fully armed with anti-ship weapons. It'd be a big risk. It would take an hour or so, but at the end of it, he'd be able to launch one huge attack, sure to destroy the American fleet. And that is what he decided to do. He would land his Midway attack force and wait until all his reserve planes were rearmed so that he could deliver the killer blow. But Nagumo's plan was already going awry. Nagumo had based his decision to postpone launching his planes until they were all ready on information he'd received from his scout plane. His own fleet was here. The report from the scout plane put the American ships here. At this distance, Nagumo knew his carriers were out of reach of the American planes. The problem was, Nagumo's scout plane was wrong. The American fleet was actually here, their planes within range. And unknown to Nagumo, American bombers from these ships were already on their way towards him.
At 9:20 a.m., the Japanese carriers were spotted by the inexperienced aircrew and the American torpedo bombers. Despite their limited training, they had no choice but to attack.
The American pilots bravely held their course towards the carriers. They hunched low and prayed they'd make it through the storm of anti-aircraft fire coming from the ships.
As they roared down towards the Japanese carriers, they were pounced on by a pack of patrolling Zeros.
The lumbering American planes were no match for the agile Zeros. 35 of the 41 torpedo bombers were shot down above the Japanese fleet, most of them without even releasing their torpedoes. Those that did, missed. The attack had been a disaster. They'd failed to score a single hit.
Nagumo was almost ready to make his move. His deck crews had been working hard to rearm and refuel his planes. if they could be launched quickly, the Japanese would surely win the Battle of Midway. At 10:21 a.m., Nagumo and his men were still not quite ready to launch their planes.
At precisely that moment, American dive bombers like this one appeared high above the Japanese carriers, and their bomb run was clear. The Japanese fighters that should have dealt with them had been drawn off to attack the American torpedo planes. There was nothing to stop these dive bombers as they began screaming down towards the decks of the Japanese carriers.
A lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting toward our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts of them, but it was too late.
There was no stopping the Americans now. 4 bombs ripped into the carrier Kaga. And another struck Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. But even as the dive bombers were attacking the Kaga and Akagi, another group of American planes, these from the Yorktown, arrived from a quite different direction. The Japanese fighters, already overstretched by the first attacks, didn't know which way to turn. Within moments, these fresh American bombers dived on a 3rd Japanese carrier, the Soryu. They slammed 3 bombs into her. Relatively few bombs had been dropped by the Americans, but their impact was devastating.